Karens are everywhere, and today, they're showing up at weddings. Here are 6 times Karens didn't survive the reception. From a Karen who collapsed after kicking her son's wedding cake, to a Karen who stormed away from a safari wedding before running into something waiting in the dark. Hi, it's Patrick, and welcome to Last Records. It was September 11th, 2015, a Saturday night at a large banquet hall outside Charlotte. The ballroom could hold more than 200 guests and was known locally for elaborate receptions with oversized floral arrangements and dramatic tiered cakes. Patricia Bennett was 67 and had spent nearly 3 decades as an elementary school administrator before retiring. Within her family, she controlled everything: holidays, birthdays, seating, menus, venues. Decisions were expected to go through her first. Most relatives had learned that disagreeing with her meant arguments that lasted weeks. Her relationship with her future daughter-in-law had been deteriorating for over a year. Patricia expected the same compliance she received from her other daughters-in-law. This one refused. During a family dinner that spring, Patricia openly criticized the bride's appearance and accused her of isolating the groom from his family. The bride responded directly in front of everyone instead of staying quiet. The room went silent. Patricia never let go of that night. The catering became its own war. Patricia wanted a company she had used for years at church banquets. The bride chose a friend who had recently opened a small catering business and offered to provide much of the food at a sharply reduced cost. The arrangement saved thousands of dollars. Patricia considered it an insult, spent months complaining privately that the bride had made the wedding look cheap, and by the week of the ceremony was saying it openly in front of relatives. It was her son's wedding. The bride was trying to save them money. Patricia spent months making it about herself. Less than a year before the wedding, Patricia had suffered a serious stroke. Recovery was difficult. She lost strength on her left side and spent months relearning balance and coordination. By September, she could walk independently, but relatives noticed she became physically unstable when upset or overtired. Her blood pressure remained hard to control, despite medication. The reception was tense from the beginning. Patricia spent much of the evening seated near the center tables, criticizing the food, the presentation, and the decision to let the bride's friend handle an event of that size. The groom tried several times to redirect the conversation. She kept returning to it. Around 9:40, staff began preparing for the cake cutting. Guests gathered near the dance floor holding phones and drinks while the music lowered for announcements. Several guests had already complimented the food and congratulated the caterer personally near the cake table, which Patricia had been watching from her seat. She stood up almost immediately after the remarks began. What followed was loud and difficult to contain. She interrupted and began arguing openly near the cake table, directing most of it at the bride. Relatives moved toward the center of the ballroom as voices rose. The bride eventually responded after Patricia insulted her and her friend directly in front of the room. Patricia stepped toward the cake table, still arguing. She lashed out with her foot and struck the lower edge hard enough to shift it sideways. The tiered cake tilted, collapsed, and crashed onto the ballroom floor. The movement threw her off balance. Her foot slipped as she stepped backward, and she fell heavily beside the collapsed stand. At first, guests assumed she had simply lost her footing. Within seconds, it became clear something else was wrong. Patricia struggled to speak. One side of her face drooped noticeably. She stopped responding to the people trying to help her. Emergency services were called at approximately 9:52. Paramedics entered through the main lobby while staff cleared the dance floor. Patricia was conscious when first responders arrived, but severely disoriented and unable to communicate. Doctors later determined she had suffered a massive recurrent stroke during the confrontation. The intense emotional stress and sudden physical exertion had likely caused a severe spike in blood pressure given her recent history. She did not survive. The reception never resumed. Guests left in near silence. The wedding that had taken months of conflict to arrive at was over before the cake had even been cut. Patricia couldn't let her son have one day without making it about herself. The next woman walked into someone else's wedding carrying a 15-year-old grudge, and I genuinely don't think she ever planned to leave quietly. It was the evening of August 14th, 2014, a Saturday. hot and humid the way Charleston gets in late summer. A waterfront hotel overlooking the harbor was hosting a wedding reception on its upper event level. Vanessa Harper was 33 and worked in Atlanta selling luxury cosmetics. People who knew her described her the same way: competitive, attention-seeking, skilled at turning uncomfortable situations into performances. She arrived with her boyfriend, who had recently separated from his wife. The divorce was still ongoing. His wife, Elena, had also been invited. The bride had stayed friends with both of them for years. Vanessa and Elena shared older history too. They had attended the same high school more than a decade earlier, with conflicts serious enough for administrators to intervene repeatedly before Vanessa eventually transferred. She blamed Elena for most of it. Former classmates privately disagreed. When the two women spotted each other across the ballroom, the recognition was immediate. Vanessa started causing friction before dinner was served, complaining to staff about seating, making loud comments about the champagne, interrupting conversations, then acting cheerful moments later as though nothing had happened. Elena stayed near relatives and avoided engaging, which seemed to irritate Vanessa further. As the evening continued and alcohol circulated, Vanessa grew louder. She made jokes about relationships where one person got too comfortable to leave, comments about people whose entire personality was being the ex-wife, and at one point, stepped directly between Elena and another guest mid-conversation and simply stood there. Her boyfriend told her twice to calm down. Both times she snapped back sharply enough that he stopped trying. Even the person who came with her tried to stop it, and she shut him down. At that point, I don't think anyone in that ballroom could have reached her. A few guests attempted to diffuse things with humor. Vanessa brushed them aside and kept escalating. Around 9:45, guests moved upstairs to the rooftop terrace for group photographs overlooking the harbor. The terrace was narrower and more crowded than the ballroom. Along one edge sat a metal and glass safety barrier overlooking the harbor access level several stories below. Hotel staff had placed a temporary raised photography platform near that section of railing, positioned unusually close to the barrier because of the limited space, with the platform's elevated surface bringing anyone standing on it significantly nearer to the top of the railing than they would otherwise be. Drinks had been spilling throughout the evening, and parts of the stone floor near the photo area had become slick. Elena had nearly made it through the night without a direct confrontation. Then relatives gathered everyone near the terrace edge for a photograph, and Vanessa stepped into the middle of the group before anyone could object. She made a remark about replacing old memories with better ones, then shifted into comments about failed marriages. Elena finally turned and quietly said this was not the time or place. Vanessa talked over her. The two women began speaking at the same time while nearby conversations stopped. The photographer stepped back. Then Vanessa made one more remark about failed marriages. Someone reached for her arm. Vanessa jerked free and collided shoulder first with Elena. Elena shoved her backward harder than she intended. Vanessa lost her footing on the wet platform surface. Because the platform sat so close to the railing, she had almost no space to recover before her momentum carried her into the barrier. She grabbed for it, but the backward pitch was already too fast. The upper half of her body went over before anyone nearby could catch her. Several guests said they didn't realize she had gone over until people near the railing started screaming. She fell several stories onto the harbor access area below. Emergency services were called immediately. Vanessa suffered catastrophic injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later interviewed more than 30 wedding guests and reviewed security footage from both levels. The hotel subsequently changed how rooftop events were staged, including removing temporary photography platforms from areas near the terrace edge during crowded gatherings. Vanessa spent the whole evening making someone else's wedding about her past. I thought that was the peak of this episode. Then I found Danielle Mercer and realized I hadn't even started yet. It was September 18th, 2019, a warm Saturday night near the northern edge of the Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya. The wedding had been planned as a luxury destination celebration for nearly 2 years. Guests had flown in different places. Danielle Mercer was 46 years old and lived in Dallas. She had built a logistics software company from scratch after years in freight coordination and warehouse management. She started with a rented office and 3 employees and eventually sold a major stake for tens of millions of dollars. She was also active on social media, where blunt business advice clips attracted a large following. People described her in contradictory ways: brilliant, funny in the right mood, genuinely generous sometimes, difficult to tolerate for long. She liked calling herself self-made and openly looked down on anyone she considered weak or unimpressive. The groom was her younger cousin. She had not originally planned to attend. Earlier that year, she described the wedding as an expensive safari photo shoot, pretending to be a marriage. The groom's father still insisted she come because investors and business associates would be there. Her success still carried social weight in those circles, despite everything that came with her. At the reserve, her mood shifted constantly. That afternoon, she entertained guests with stories about building her company during the 2008 freight collapse. An hour later, she loudly asked a lodge employee whether he understood basic English after a transportation mix-up. By the time the reception started, many guests were already avoiding her table. The reception took place in a large open-air pavilion surrounded by lantern poles and portable floodlights, powered by generators behind the kitchen tents. Beyond the lit perimeter, the landscape disappeared almost immediately into darkness. Rangers had warned guests repeatedly not to wander past the reception area after sunset. Wildlife moved close to the property at night. Earlier that day, guests returning from safari drives had reported buffalo near one of the service roads less than a quarter mile from the lodge. Alcohol had been flowing for hours by the time Danielle took the microphone shortly before 10 p.m. She started normally enough before drifting into increasingly uncomfortable remarks about wealth, marriage, and family image. Guests laughed nervously. Others tried interrupting her quietly from nearby tables. She talked over all of them and eventually implied the bride had pursued the groom because of his family connections. The groom stepped forward and told staff to cut the microphone. Can you imagine? She flew in from afar just to ruin the day with her words. I don't know what she thought was going to happen after that. Danielle reacted badly. She shouted at relatives near the stage, grabbed her phone, and walked away from the pavilion into the darkness beyond the reception lights. She began live streaming herself while walking toward a line of parked Land Cruisers used earlier for safari tours. Her words became repetitive and slurred. At one point, she could be heard saying nobody even likes each other half the time. 2 lodge employees and a ranger moved after her when they noticed movement near the brush line beyond the vehicles. They called out to her. Danielle laughed at the warning and kept walking. What happened next was over before anyone could reach her. The buffalo had apparently been moving along the brush line before noise, vehicle positioning, and floodlights pushed it into the narrow space between the parked Land Cruisers. The animal was massive and moving at full speed when Danielle came around the side of the nearest vehicle. The first impact knocked her off her feet and threw her beside the Land Cruiser. The animal didn't stop. Startled and cornered between the vehicles, it trampled and gored in a blind panic before rangers reached the scene and fired warning shots into the air. She was declared dead at the scene after emergency responders arrived. There was nothing to be done by the time anyone reached her. The wedding reception ended immediately. Rangers escorted all guests back to their lodges in secured vehicles. Local authorities sealed off the surrounding area overnight for investigation. The next one flew in from Mumbai, and I want to be honest, from the moment she walked through that door, she wasn't acting like a guest. It was December 11th, 2018. A luxury hilltop resort outside Asheville, North Carolina. Nearly 300 guests had gathered for an extravagant winter wedding. The reception hall overlooked rain-covered mountain scenery through towering glass walls. Priya Malhotra was 52 years old and lived in Mumbai, India. She owned a chain of upscale restaurants and boutique hotels across Western India. She was accustomed to being treated with what she called proper respect and made sure everyone around her understood that. Through long-standing business connections with the bride's parents, she had quietly contributed a massive amount of money toward the wedding months earlier. The bride had never been told. Her parents assumed it would never become an issue. It became one before dinner was finished. Priya arrived acting less like a guest and more like the owner of the entire event. She interrupted venue staff, demanded seating adjustments moments before the ceremony began, criticized floral arrangements in front of decorators, and insisted photographers prioritize her over close relatives. Throughout the evening, she reminded anyone nearby that none of this would exist without her. She snapped at servers, argued with musicians over song choices, and kept demanding champagne long after bartenders tried cutting her off. At one point, she complained openly that the bride spent too much time thanking people who had contributed nothing. Shortly after 11 p.m., the bride gave an emotional speech thanking family members, childhood friends, and the people who helped organize the wedding. Priya sat holding her champagne glass and smiling. She was certain her name was coming. The speech ended without mentioning her once. I want to be fair. She contributed a significant amount of money, but she did it secretly and then expected a public reward. That is not generosity. That is a transaction she never disclosed. She stood up immediately and began criticizing the bride in front of the entire room. She shouted that she had paid for half the wedding and demanded people acknowledge her. Relatives and staff tried calming her down. The bride stood at the microphone, visibly shaken, hearing for the first time exactly how much had been contributed behind her back. Nothing calmed Priya down. She was already past that point. Very furious and struggling to keep her balance in a narrow designer heels, she stormed out of the reception hall into the cold, wet night, carrying a nearly full champagne glass. Guests followed, urging her to slow down. She ignored them and kept moving down the rain-soaked marble staircase toward the valet entrance while yelling back toward the doors. Halfway down, her heel caught the wet marble. She fell backward. The back of her head struck the sharp stone edge of a step before her body came to rest several steps below. The champagne glass shattered beside her. Paramedics found her unconscious with severe head trauma and heavy bleeding. She was transported to a nearby trauma hospital in critical condition. Doctors confirmed a catastrophic skull fracture and massive traumatic brain injury. Despite emergency surgery, Priya was pronounced dead shortly after midnight. The reception continued quietly at the request of both families. The atmosphere was already gone. I didn't want to include Sabrina's case. I really didn't. But once I read it, I couldn't justify leaving it out. It was the evening of August 14th, 2018, a humid Saturday night in the waterfront district of Tampa. The wedding reception took place inside a newly renovated luxury ballroom overlooking the harbor, where yacht lights reflected across the water beyond the glass walls of the venue. Sabrina Vale was 34 years old and lived in Miami, where she worked as an office manager for a medical supply company. She projected wealth and importance despite living far beyond her means. Friends described her as demanding, argumentative, and obsessed with status. She expected special treatment everywhere she went and became openly hostile when she felt ignored or embarrassed in public. She attended the wedding as the +1 of Nathan Cole, one of the groom's longtime college friends. Very few guests had met her before that evening. By mid-evening, Sabrina had already become a problem. She complained repeatedly about her table placement, criticized staff over drink service, and argued with a bartender about the champagne selection. Several guests heard her call parts of the wedding decor cheap. As the night continued and alcohol kept flowing, she became more confrontational. Despite repeated announcements prohibiting smoking or vaping indoors, she openly used a vape device near the ballroom exits and dance floor several times. Security had already warned her. The announcements had already covered it. I genuinely cannot tell you what made her think the rules were for everyone else in that ballroom except her. Around 10:15 p.m., venue security approached her after multiple complaints from nearby guests and warned she would be removed if it continued. The confrontation drew attention from surrounding tables and visibly embarrassed her. She argued loudly with security before walking away toward the restricted backstage section behind the reception stage. The stage had been rebuilt that day, using synthetic drapery and fabric panels heavily coated in aerosol shimmer spray during setup. Unlike permanent venue materials, none of it was held to fire retardant standards, effectively turning the entire backstage arrangement into chemically primed material waiting for a spark. Sabrina entered the backstage area alone, removed a lighter, and attempted to light a cigarette near the rear stage curtains. The flame caught the aerosol residue coating the synthetic backdrop and spread faster than the fabric alone would ever have allowed. Guests near the stage heard shouting, followed by a sudden burst of flames rising behind the curtains. Fire spread rapidly upward through the synthetic drapery and hanging decorative panels surrounding the stage supports. Several guests initially mistook the flames for part of the reception lighting before smoke began pouring into the ballroom. Burning drapery and a collapsing decorative frame blocked the narrow service path behind the stage and temporarily trapped two nearby event workers. Sabrina, standing closest to the ignition point, became trapped near the rear backdrop as flames spread through the backstage corridor. Staff activated fire alarms, while others attempted to reach the trapped victims through heavy smoke and falling debris. Emergency services were called at approximately 10:18 p.m. as guests evacuated through the ballroom exits. Heat from the growing fire triggered the overhead sprinkler system and slowed the spread before firefighters arrived. Fire crews forced their way through the partially collapsed stage and pulled the two event workers out alive with severe burns and smoke inhalation injuries. Sabrina had remained trapped closest to where the fire started. Firefighters carried her through a rear service corridor, while paramedics began emergency treatment outside the venue entrance beneath emergency floodlights. She was transported to a nearby trauma hospital in critical condition with catastrophic burns and severe airway damage from superheated smoke inhalation. Despite multiple resuscitation attempts in the trauma unit, she was pronounced dead later that night. The fire was later ruled accidental ignition involving open flame and aerosol-treated synthetic decorative material. The venue introduced strict no-smoking policies and tighter backstage access restrictions for all future events. I need a second before the next one, because Jade Marlowe is the case in this episode where I kept asking myself, how many times does someone have to be told before they listen? The answer, in her case, was that no number was ever going to be enough. It was September 22nd, 2019, a luxury waterfront estate outside Charleston, South Carolina. The pavilion overlooked the harbor, and at the center of it all hung an enormous suspended floral installation directly above the dance floor. Jade Marlowe was 39 years old and was one of the best-known luxury wedding stylists in the region. She was also one of the most difficult people anyone who worked with her had ever encountered. She constantly boasted that she understood high-end aesthetics better than venue management ever could, and argued with contractors, photographers, and safety staff whenever they questioned her decisions. Her reputation for extravagant designs came with an equally well-known reputation for being impossible to work with. During setup the day before the wedding, venue engineers and rigging contractors warned her that the suspended structure exceeded the recommended weight limit for the pavilion's mounting points. They advised installing additional steel support cables and leaving visible stabilization braces in place before guests arrived. Jade dismissed the warnings without much consideration. She insisted she had built similar installations at multiple venues without any problems, and told the engineers they were being overly cautious because they did not understand event design. I've seen entitlement in these cases, but standing under a structure you refuse to secure and arguing about lighting is something else entirely. When safety cables appeared in test photographs, she became furious. She complained the hardware destroyed the illusion and ordered assistance to remove several secondary stabilization supports, despite repeated objections from the rigging crew. Workers later described her moving through the venue in an aggressive and controlling mood, standing over people, criticizing small details, and demanding last-minute changes, while ignoring the mounting concerns overhead. Anyone who hesitated or questioned her judgment was mocked in front of the rest of the crew. By evening, nearly 200 guests filled the pavilion beneath the structure. Several staff members noticed faint metallic creaking sounds coming from overhead during the night. Most assumed it was lighting equipment, shifting in the coastal wind. Around 9:40 p.m., Jade began arguing with venue staff about repositioning the overhead lighting to improve how the canopy looked in photographs. Witnesses later recalled her standing directly beneath the center of the structure while pointing angrily toward lighting technicians above her. One of the primary mounting connections failed seconds later, Witnesses said the suspended structure shifted suddenly to one side before the remaining supports gave way in rapid succession. Heavy metal framing, chandeliers, lighting equipment, and dense floral sections crashed onto the dance floor below. Guests fled through falling debris, shattered glass, and collapsing metal supports. Emergency services were called immediately. Firefighters, paramedics, and rescue crews arrived within minutes and forced their way through the wreckage, while injured guests were treated outside for fractures, cuts, and crush injuries. Jade had been standing at the center of the collapse. Rescue crews spent nearly 20 minutes cutting through sections of collapsed metal framing to reach her. She was found unresponsive beneath the debris and was later pronounced dead at the scene from unsurvivable crush injuries. The collapse was later linked directly to the removed safety supports. The venue permanently banned oversized suspended decorative installations afterward. I thought Jade was going to be the last case I added to this episode. Then I found Jasmine, and I realized I'd been wrong about that. It was May 22nd, 2017. A renovated waterfront event hall in Savannah, Georgia, stood beside a narrow stretch of river lined with anchored boats and private docks. The venue had become popular for upscale weddings because of its upper mezzanine level and the decorative reinforced glass flooring built into one side of the elevated walkway overlooking a lounge area below. Jasmine Martinez was 28 and worked as a property manager for vacation rentals owned by relatives outside Savannah. She had always maintained an unusually possessive relationship with her cousin and became openly resentful after his engagement to Olivia Bennett in late 2016. Family gatherings grew increasingly uncomfortable in the months before the wedding. Jasmine criticized Olivia constantly, inserted herself into private decisions, and behaved as though she had greater authority over the marriage than the bride herself. Months earlier, she had repeatedly seen Olivia meeting privately with a man around Savannah and convinced herself an affair was taking place. Rather than confronting Olivia directly, she continued quietly watching and drawing conclusions from isolated observations. The man was actually Olivia's stepbrother, who had recently completed treatment at a rehabilitation facility after years of addiction problems. Olivia had kept the situation private while deciding whether he was stable enough to reconnect with family. There had never been an affair. Jasmine had simply spent months reinforcing a conclusion she had already decided to believe. She watched. She gathered evidence. She built a whole case, and not once did she consider she might be wrong. I find that harder to understand than almost anything else in this story. The reception began around 6:30 with more than 100 guests. By 10 p.m., dinner had ended and guests had spread throughout the ballroom, mezzanine, balcony, and bar areas. Jasmine spent much of the evening watching Olivia rather than participating, interrupting conversations involving the bride, inserting herself into family photographs, making hostile remarks about Olivia's character to relatives. Family members attempted to calm her multiple times without success. The venue already had unresolved structural concerns involving the glass flooring above the lounge corridor beneath the mezzanine. Earlier inspections had documented worsening separation around one of the steel support joints, connecting several glass panels, restricting access to the affected section until repairs were completed were recommended. Venue management postponed repairs until after the spring event season, considering the damage non-urgent since the area remained visually intact. Late in the evening, Olivia noticed her stepbrother arriving near the entrance, looking visibly distressed. Security footage later showed the two briefly moving into a quieter corridor beside the lounge area. After watching them disappear from the ballroom, Jasmine moved upstairs toward the mezzanine overlooking the corridor below. The mezzanine had grown heavily crowded near the bar as guests moved back and forth carrying drinks. Jasmine positioned herself near the center section and repeatedly shifted sideways between guests, leaning forward through the reinforced panels trying to maintain sight of the corridor beneath her. The The glass panels shifted unevenly near one side of the walkway. Before anyone could react, part of the connected flooring gave way. Several guests stumbled backward. One man fractured his wrist against the railing. Another received cuts from shattered glass near the collapse edge. Jasmine, standing closest to the compromised support joint while leaning forward, fell directly through the opening, along with sections of broken glass and metal framing into the lounge below. Emergency services arrived shortly afterward, secured both levels before beginning rescue efforts. Jasmine was transported in critical condition and pronounced dead a short time later from traumatic injuries sustained in the fall. Investigators later confirmed there had been no affair. Structural inspectors concluded the collapse resulted from pre-existing joint separation beneath the glass flooring combined with sustained crowd load during the reception. The venue closed for structural renovation 3 days later and permanently removed guest access from all decorative glass flooring.